Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to untangle a totally massive, historically complex relationship, the intersection between international development and human rights. We often just take it for granted that a wealthy country should naturally also be a free and fair country. But for decades, these two ideas were treated like total strangers on the global stage. Today, well, they're considered inseparable. But getting to this point was, frankly, anything but easy.
So let's just dive right into this with a really provocative question to frame our entire discussion. Can a nation be economically developed but fundamentally unfree? This very question is the beating heart of a 70-year epic clash of ideas. We're going to explore exactly how global policy evolved from the ashes of World War II to try and answer this dilemma, and how our entire understanding of human progress completely transformed along the way.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll track this evolution across 6 quick stages, starting with the Great Divide, moving into decolonization and new demands, the push for a right to development, how the Washington Consensus fails, the paradigm shift of a rights-based approach, and finally, our modern shared future. Let's get to it.
Part 1. The Great Divide. We're starting in the 1950s and 60s. This was a period where international law and global institutions basically treated economic growth and human rights as totally separate issues. They existed in complete silos.
Think about the Cold War era. Development was deeply polarized into two major competing strategies. On one side, championed primarily by the US and the West, you had the market-oriented approach. This was all about the free flow of goods, services, and investment, operating on the core belief that free market efficiencies were absolutely the best engine for progress. Then, on the flip side, you had the statist approach. This was heavily influenced by the Soviet model and used by a lot of newly independent nations. Their argument was that rapid industrialization required the state to aggressively step in, marshal, and direct all national resources.
But here is the really fascinating part: the shared flaw. Despite being fierce geopolitical enemies who agreed on practically nothing, both of these models implicitly agreed on one massive thing. Human rights were completely secondary to the overriding goal of modernization. Market-oriented strategies often totally rejected state interventions for economic and social rights, claiming they just bogged down growth. They'd even occasionally support regimes that crushed civil liberties just to maintain a friendly business climate. Statist strategies, meanwhile, argued the state needed to be free from the so-called political interference of human rights to actually get things done. They severely restricted freedoms of speech, press, and assembly to force rapid national unity. So, in both camps, rights were basically sacrificed for the promise of a wealthier tomorrow.
That brings us to Part 2, decolonization and new demands, because by the mid-1960s, the global landscape was shifting beneath everyone's feet.
As the UN's membership absolutely exploded, jumping from 80 nations in 1956 to 122 by 1966, newly independent states from the Global South were waking up to a harsh reality. Formal political freedom did not automatically equal economic freedom. This realization gave rise to something called dependency theory, popularized by economists like Raoul Prebisch. The idea is simple but devastating. Developing countries were basically trapped. Let's say you're a country exporting a raw primary product, like coffee or sugar. Back in 1950, a certain amount of your sugar harvest could buy you an imported tractor. But because of how global markets were rigged, by 1960, that exact same amount of sugar could buy you less than a full tractor. And by 1970, even less. Imagine working twice as hard just to afford the exact same equipment you bought 10 years ago. Your progress was literally stalled because the terms of trade were fundamentally stacked against you.
And this wasn't just an economic frustration for these nations. It was felt as a profound, deep injustice. Senegalese diplomat Doudou Thiam really passionately articulated this at the UN in 1966. He said, "An actual pillage of the developing countries has been organized on a worldwide scale." He was arguing that while the old, formal colonial pacts were technically abolished, a neo-colonial economic system had just quietly slipped in to take their place, keeping the majority under the thumb of a wealthy minority.
This boiling frustration sparked Part 3, the right to development. The Global South was officially done asking for charity. They were demanding equity.
Let's look at how this momentum built up over the decades. In the 1960s, the UN kicks off its first development decade. Then, by 1966, human rights covenants finally codified the right to self-determination. And crucially, this included a nation's right to freely dispose of its own natural wealth and resources. Fast forward to the 1970s, and developing nations band together to push for a new international economic order.
All of this finally culminates in 1986 with the UN Declaration on the Right to Development. This was a massive conceptual leap. For the very first time, international text formally stated that the human person, not just a national economy or a GDP, is the central subject and beneficiary of development.
But, as we know, a theory on paper is one thing, and harsh economic reality is another. Enter Part 4, the Washington Consensus Fails.
The post-World War II golden years of non-stop economic growth came crashing to a halt with the global downturn of the 1970s. In response, during the 1980s, Western-dominated financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF rolled out what became known as the Washington Consensus. They basically started conditioning loans to desperate developing countries on aggressive, radical market-oriented programs. They literally called it structural adjustments or shock therapy. And the prescriptions were totally rigid: severe tax cuts, massive deregulation, rapid privatization of national industries, and, most critically, deep, painful cuts to public sector budgets. We're talking about slashing funding for crucial social programs aimed at food, health, housing, and education.
The crucial takeaway here is the human cost. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the evidence was just undeniable. This one-size-fits-all model of development without rights, it largely failed. Sure, there were a few isolated successes in middle-income countries, but they were vastly overshadowed by failures, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa. Ignoring human rights in favor of pure, unchecked market economics didn't just hurt spreadsheets, it resulted in immense human suffering, catastrophic social failures, and in many places, actual measurable declines in living standards. The strategy was fundamentally broken. This massive, very public failure forced a global reckoning, which sparks Part 5, a human rights-based approach, a true paradigm shift.
There was a complete paradigm shift in the 1990s, spurred by brilliant thinkers like Amartya Sen, who famously redefined poverty not just as a lack of income, but as a capability deprivation. The entire metric of what we considered success changed. Traditional development had measured success strictly by GDP. It focused on national economies and prioritized trade. But Sustainable Human Development, which was introduced by the UN in 1990, swapped that out for the Human Development Index, or HDI. Suddenly, success is evaluated based on the human person, prioritizing health, education, and human dignity right up there alongside income. Development was no longer just about making a country richer, it was about making its people freer and more capable.
To actually make this real, the UN established clear, legal obligations for states. They broke down these abstract human rights into 4 actionable steps. Let's use housing as a concrete example. Step 1. Respect. The state simply must not actively deprive you of your housing. Step 2. Protect. The state has to prevent third parties, like landlords, from discriminating against you. Step 3. Promote. The state needs to create public policies to ensure affordable housing actually exists. And finally, Step 4. Fulfill. If you absolutely cannot secure housing yourself, the state has a fundamental duty to directly provide for the vulnerable. Just like that, human rights became a tangible, practical tool for evaluating if development policies were actually working for everyday people.
Which brings us right into the new millennium for Part 6, the modern shared future. Today, development and human rights are officially, inextricably intertwined in global policy. Back in the year 2000, the UN launched the Millennium Development Goals to tackle extreme poverty and health crises. And while they definitely made some progress, they ultimately fell short of their 2015 deadlines. Plus, they were mostly focused on telling developing countries what they needed to do. Learning from those shortfalls, the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this was a game changer because it's a truly universal framework. It applies to the wealthy global north just as much as it does to the global south. 169. I know, it sounds like a lot, but that is the exact number of specific, measurable targets within the modern Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. While 169 targets might sound like a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare, it actually shows the immense scale and the utter seriousness of today's framework, especially when you compare it to the vague, empty promises of the 1950s. We now have hardcore statistical measures tying development directly to real human rights outcomes. Today's agenda isn't just about factory output. It's a balancing act. It purposefully balances economic growth targets with profound human development, the aggressive reduction of both gender and income inequality, and vital environmental sustainability and climate action. It's the whole shebang, and all of this operates under a human rights umbrella. It is literally the culmination of decades of hard lessons. You simply cannot have sustainable economic progress without respecting human dignity.
But we're going to leave you with this final provocative thought. The global consensus has synthesized rights and development beautifully on paper. The frameworks are all there, but in practice, many donor states still heavily resist the idea that development assistance is a strict international obligation. They often prefer to use it as a patron-client political tool or a lever to get what they want. So if human rights and development are now theoretically unified, how do we close that massive gap between international theory and the stark, messy political realities of the modern world? That right there is the ultimate challenge for the next era of global progress. Thank you so much for joining us on The Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.